Welcome to another scenario of alternative history, thoughts you get before going to sleep. Tonight, we journey to a world transformed by a single moment of understanding. A world where the vast stretches of Russia and the intricate tapestry of Europe never became adversaries locked in centuries of mistrust and conflict. Imagine a timeline where the bridges between East and West were never burned, where the Orthodox and Catholic worlds found common ground rather than divergence, and where the great Slavic realm became not a rival to European powers, but a partner in shaping the destiny of the continent. Our point of divergence occurs in the year 1054, at the moment of the Great Schism that split Christianity into Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. In our world, theological disputes and political ambitions drove a wedge between Rome and Constantinople that would echo through the centuries, creating a religious and cultural fault line that separated Russia from Western Europe. But consider a world where cooler heads prevailed, where the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Pope of Rome found compromise in their theological differences, where the question of whether the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father alone or from both Father and Son did not shatter the unity of Christendom. In this alternate timeline, a council is convened in Jerusalem, neutral ground for both parties, in the spring of 1054. The Pope, understanding the political implications of a permanent split, agrees to recognize the autonomy of the Eastern churches while maintaining a spiritual connection. The Patriarch, seeing the benefits of a united Christian front against external threats, accepts a ceremonial primacy of Rome while preserving Eastern liturgical traditions. The Filioque controversy is resolved through elegant theological compromise, acknowledging different expressions of the same divine truth. This reconciliation sends ripples across the medieval world. The Russian principalities, still young and forming their identity, do not develop the sense of isolated Orthodox exceptionalism that would later define Moscow as the Third Rome. Instead, Russia sees itself as the eastern frontier of a greater Christian civilization, different in culture and language, but united in faith and purpose with the kingdoms of the West. The Grand Princes of Kiev and later Moscow maintained diplomatic and religious ties with Rome, Constantinople, and the courts of Europe simultaneously. Trade routes that might have been hindered by religious suspicion remain open and flourish. Merchants from Venice and Genoa find welcome in Novgorod and Kiev without the barrier of religious difference. The Hanseatic League extends its reach deeper into Russian territories, creating economic interdependence that makes conflict unthinkable. Russian nobles send their children to be educated in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, while European scholars travel to study at monasteries in Vladimir and Suzdal, where ancient Greek texts are preserved and copied by Orthodox monks. In the Mongol invasion of the 13th century, rather than isolating Russia from Europe, becomes a shared crisis that brings them closer together. European knights and Russian princes fight side by side against the Golden Horde, forging bonds of brotherhood in battle. The devastation is immense, but it is faced together. Pope and Patriarch jointly call for crusades, not against each other's faithful, but against the Mongol threat. The military orders, Teutonic Knights, Knights Hospitaller, and newly formed Russian orders coordinate their defense of Christendom's eastern frontier. In the century following the resolution of the schism, the shape of European civilization takes on a distinctly different character. The Russian principalities, no longer isolated by religious division, participate fully in the cultural and intellectual movements that sweep through medieval Europe. The Gothic architectural revolution that transforms Western Europe also reaches Russia, where master builders from France and Germany work alongside Russian craftsmen to create soaring cathedrals in Moscow and Vladimir that blend Western Gothic arches with Eastern icon traditions and onion domes. The Mongol yoke that in our timeline lasted 2.5 centuries is lifted sooner through coordinated European-Russian military efforts. By 1350, a series of decisive battles fought by combined armies of Polish, Hungarian, German, and Russian forces breaks the power of the Golden Horde. The liberation is celebrated across Europe as a shared victory, cementing Russia's place as a defender of Christian civilization. Russian princes who led the liberation become heroes throughout Europe, with songs and chronicles celebrating their deeds in courts from England to Italy. The Black Death that ravages Europe in the mid-14th century does not respect borders, and Russia suffers alongside the West. However, the response is coordinated rather than isolated. Medical knowledge flows more freely between monasteries and universities. Russian monks who preserved ancient Greek medical texts share this knowledge with European physicians. The quarantine measures developed in Italian port cities are quickly adopted in Novgorod and other Russian trading centers. While the death toll remains catastrophic, the shared struggle creates new bonds of human sympathy across the continent. The rise of Moscow as the predominant Russian power follows a different path. Grand Prince Ivan I, known as Kalita, the Moneybag, who reigned in the early 14th century, maintains close ties with both the Golden Horde and European powers, playing a sophisticated diplomatic game. His successors, rather than positioning Moscow as the Third Rome in opposition to a fallen Constantinople and heretical West, instead cultivate Moscow's image as a bridge between civilizations, a meeting point of East and West, a city where Greek, Latin, and Slavonic learning intermingle. The Renaissance, when it comes, flows naturally into Russia. Italian artists and architects find eager patrons among Russian nobles who have long maintained connections with Western Europe. Russian painters begin incorporating perspective and naturalism into icon painting, creating a unique fusion style. Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks contain sketches made during a journey to Moscow in 1499, where he studied Russian fortification techniques and the vast forests of the north. In return, Russian artists studying in Florence bring back techniques that transform religious art across the Orthodox world. The printing press, invented by Gutenberg in the 1450s, spreads to Russia within a generation rather than taking a century. By 1480, printing houses operate in Moscow and Novgorod, producing books in Cyrillic alongside Latin texts. This rapid dissemination of knowledge accelerates literacy and learning across Russia. Religious texts previously laboriously hand-copied by monks become available to parish priests and educated laypeople. Classical works of Greek and Roman literature, philosophical treatises, and scientific texts flow in both directions across the continent. The marriage alliances between Russian and European royal houses, which existed to some degree in our timeline, become far more common and significant. Russian princes are considered desirable matches for Western kings, bringing vast dowries and alliances with a powerful realm. European princes seek Russian brides for the same reasons. By the late 15th century, the royal families of Europe and Russia are extensively intermarried, creating a web of familial connections that makes major warfare between them almost unthinkable, as it would pit cousin against cousin, brother against brother. The 16th century brings transformations that reshape the political landscape of the entire continent. The Protestant Reformation, which in our world shattered Catholic unity and created new religious conflicts, unfolds differently when Christianity has maintained its East-West connection. When Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517, the reaction is not purely condemnatory. The presence of Eastern Christian traditions within the broader Christian communion provides models for diversity within unity. Russian theologians, invited to participate in the Council of Trent convened to address the Reformation crisis, offer perspectives shaped by Eastern Christianity's different historical development. The concept of married priests, long accepted in Eastern tradition, influences debates about clerical celibacy. The Eastern understanding of salvation and grace, different in emphasis from Western scholastic theology, provides alternative frameworks for discussing Luther's concerns about indulgences and justification. While the Catholic Church does not abandon its core doctrines, it demonstrates greater flexibility, and the split that occurs is less catastrophic. The result is a more complex but less violent religious landscape. Protestant movements still emerge, but the example of Eastern and Western Christianity maintaining unity despite significant theological and liturgical differences provides a model for coexistence. The religious wars that devastated Central Europe in our timeline are shorter and less destructive. The 30 Years' War, in particular, either does not occur or is limited to a brief regional conflict, sparing Germany from the demographic catastrophe that reduced its population by a third. The Grand Duchy of Moscow, by this time styling itself as the Tsardom of Russia under Ivan III, pursues an expansionist policy that is accommodated within European power structures rather than opposed by them. The conquest of Kazan and Astrakhan, bringing Tatar territories under Russian control, is celebrated in European courts as the final victory over the Mongol threat. Russia's expansion into Siberia, which begins in the 1580s under the Cossack Yermak Timofeyevich, is viewed similarly to Spanish and Portuguese overseas expansion, a Christian power extending civilization into pagan lands. The colonization of Siberia proceeds faster with European participation. English and Dutch trading companies establish offices in Russian cities and help finance expeditions into the vast eastern territories. German miners bring advanced techniques to exploit the Urals' mineral wealth. Italian cartographers help map the new territories. The settlement of Siberia becomes a pan-European enterprise, with adventurers and colonists from across the continent seeking opportunities in Russia's expanding frontier. The political theory of the age develops differently when Russian philosophers and political thinkers participate in European intellectual discourse. The concept of autocracy, which in our timeline became associated with Russian backwardness, is instead debated and refined in dialogue with Western ideas about sovereignty and governance. Russian theorists, drawing on Byzantine political philosophy, contribute to debates about the divine right of kings and the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority. Some Russian thinkers, influenced by exposure to Italian city republics and German free cities, even advocate for limited representative institutions. By the early 17th century, Russia has become an integral member of the European balance of power system. Treaties are negotiated, alliances formed and broken, and dynastic marriages arranged, with Russia as a full participant rather than an outsider. When the Swedish Empire under Gustavus Adolphus rises to challenge the existing order, Russia is courted by all sides. The Great Northern War that in our timeline pitted Russia against Sweden instead becomes a more complex multipolar conflict in which Russia's alignment determines the outcome. The Ottoman Empire, without a divided Christian Europe to exploit, faces a more formidable opponent. The Siege of Vienna in 1529, rather than being a primarily Austrian affair with limited assistance, becomes a rallying point for a massive coordinated Christian response. Russian forces march westward to join the relief of the city. The long struggle against Ottoman expansion becomes a unifying factor for Europe and Russia, creating shared military traditions and mutual respect forged in battle against a common foe.
The cultural fusion that develops over these centuries creates a civilization that is recognizably European but richer and more diverse than in our timeline. Russian becomes a language of cultivation, studied by European intellectuals, just as French and Italian are learned by Russian nobles. By the 17th century, a Russian-educated gentleman is equally comfortable conversing in Russian, French, German, and Latin. Likewise, a European scholar considers knowledge of Russian essential for accessing the Byzantine philosophical and theological tradition preserved in Slavonic texts. Literature flourishes in this environment of cultural exchange. The epic tradition of Russian folk tales and bylinyi influences European literature, while Russian writers absorb techniques from Western authors. When Miguel de Cervantes publishes Don Quixote in 1605, it is translated into Russian within a decade and inspires Russian writers to develop their own tradition of the novel. Conversely, the great Russian epic The Tale of Igor's Campaign circulates in Latin translation throughout Europe, influencing Western epic poetry. Musical traditions also intermingle. The haunting harmonies of Orthodox liturgical music, with its emphasis on unaccompanied voices and complex choral arrangements, fascinates Western composers. By the Baroque era, elements of Russian choral technique appear in the works of German and Italian composers. Russian musicians travel to study in Venice and Vienna, bringing back knowledge of Western instrumentation while contributing their own traditions. The development of opera in the 17th century incorporates Russian folk melodies and Orthodox hymns alongside Italian and German musical idioms. Architecture evolves into distinctive regional styles that share common principles while expressing local character. The ornate Russian Baroque that develops in the 18th century emerges from genuine synthesis rather than imported imitation. Palace architects from Italy, France, and Germany work in Russia, while Russian master builders contribute to projects across Europe. The result is a pan-European architectural language with regional accents, where a building in Moscow and a building in Paris are clearly cousins rather than strangers. Social structures evolve under mutual influence. The Russian institution of serfdom, which in our timeline persisted until 1861 and became a defining mark of Russian backwardness, faces earlier pressure for reform due to European criticism and comparison. While agricultural labor remains bound to the land longer than in Western Europe, the most extreme aspects of serfdom are moderated by the mid-18th century. Conversely, European societies adopt certain Russian practices, particularly regarding the integration of conquered peoples and the management of multi-ethnic empires. Education becomes increasingly standardized across Europe and Russia. The great universities of the West, Oxford, Cambridge, Paris, Bologna, and Prague, have Russian scholars on their faculties and Russian students in their halls. Russia establishes its first university in Moscow in 1687, nearly a century earlier than in our timeline, modeled on European institutions but incorporating elements of the Orthodox academy tradition. Academic exchange programs allow students and professors to move freely between institutions across the continent. The position of women in society evolves differently when Russian and European practices interact. Traditional Russian culture, which allowed women certain property rights and influence unknown in parts of Western Europe, provides models that feminist thinkers cite in debates about women's status. The salon culture that flourishes in France during the Enlightenment has parallels in Russian cities, where educated noble women host intellectual gatherings that blend Western Enlightenment ideas with Russian literary and philosophical traditions. Religious life takes on a character that reflects the maintained unity of Christianity. While distinct liturgical traditions persist, with Latin Rite churches and Byzantine Rite churches serving different communities, there is free communion between them. Monasteries become centers of cultural exchange, where monks from different traditions work side by side, copying manuscripts and pursuing theological studies. Pilgrimage routes connect holy sites across the continent, with Russian pilgrims visiting Rome and Santiago de Compostela, while European pilgrims journey to the ancient churches of Kiev and the monasteries of the Russian north.
The economic development of Europe and Russia in this altered timeline creates a more integrated and prosperous continent. The trade routes that in our world were often interrupted by conflict and suspicion instead function as reliable arteries of commerce. The great Russian rivers, the Volga, Dnieper, and Don, become extensions of European trade networks, connecting the Baltic and Black Seas to markets in Central Asia and Persia. Russian grain, timber, furs, and honey flow westward in unprecedented quantities, while European manufactured goods, textiles, wines, and luxury items move eastward. The terms of trade are more balanced than in our timeline's later period, when Russia primarily exported raw materials. Russian cities developed manufacturing industries earlier, learning techniques from European artisans who settle in Novgorod, Moscow, and other centers. By the 17th century, Russian textile mills and metalworks compete with European producers in quality, if not yet in quantity. The discovery of the New World and the opening of oceanic trade routes affects Russia differently when it is part of the European commercial system rather than excluded from it. Russian merchants invest in trading companies exploring the Americas and circumnavigating the globe. Russian ships, built with assistance from Dutch and English shipwrights, join expeditions to distant waters. The port of Archangel, developed with European investment and expertise, becomes a major commercial hub connecting overland routes from Asia with maritime routes to the Atlantic. The colonization of Siberia transforms from a slow, haphazard process into a coordinated development program. European capital and expertise accelerate the exploitation of Siberian resources. German mining techniques extract copper, iron, and eventually gold from the Ural Mountains. Dutch engineers help develop agriculture in suitable regions. By the 18th century, Russian cities rival those of European Russia in size and sophistication, connected by improved roads and later canals. Banking and finance develop in Russia parallel to their evolution in Western Europe. Rather than remaining dependent on foreign capital, Russian banking houses emerge in the 17th century, often founded by merchants who made fortunes in the fur trade or Siberian mining. These institutions participate in the complex web of credit and investment that finances European commerce and industry. Russian investors hold shares in Dutch and English trading companies, while European bankers finance Russian development projects. The agricultural revolution that transforms European farming between the 16th and 18th centuries reaches Russia with less delay. New crops from the Americas, particularly potatoes and maize, are introduced to Russia through established trade channels and quickly adopted. European agronomic treatises are translated into Russian and distributed to estate owners. Russian agricultural experiments, particularly in adapting crops to harsh climates, contribute knowledge that benefits Northern European farming. The Industrial Revolution, when it comes in the 18th century, spreads more evenly across this integrated economic space. Coal deposits in the Donetsk Basin and the Urals are developed using English mining techniques. Russian iron, produced in modern blast furnaces built with European technology, competes on European markets. Textile mills appear in Russian cities equipped with British machinery but powered by Russian rivers. By the end of the 18th century, Russia is not an economically backward periphery, but a developing industrial power whose trajectory parallels that of Germany or northern Italy. Labor mobility increases as economic integration deepens. German and Dutch craftsmen settle in Russian cities, bringing skills in clockmaking, optics, and precision metalwork. Russian workers travel west to learn trades, many returning to establish workshops at home. Mining communities in the Urals become remarkably cosmopolitan, with Russian, German, Polish, and Swedish workers laboring side by side in conditions that, while harsh, are similar to those in European mining regions.
The scientific revolution that transforms European understanding of the natural world in the 16th and 17th centuries proceeds with Russian participation from its earliest stages. The work of Copernicus, published in 1543, finds an audience among Russian scholars trained in Greek astronomical texts. The observations of Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler are discussed in Russian academies alongside orthodox theological interpretations of the cosmos. Russian natural philosophers contribute distinctive perspectives shaped by their environment and traditions. The vast forests, great rivers, and extreme climates of Russia provide unique laboratories for natural observation. Russian scholars studying magnetism note variations at high latitudes that contribute to understanding of Earth's magnetic field. The aurora borealis, regularly visible in northern Russia, is systematically observed and described for European scientific journals. Siberian explorations yield specimens of flora and fauna previously unknown to European science. The correspondence networks that connect scientists across Europe extend naturally to Russia. When Galileo Galilei faces trial in 1633 for his support of heliocentrism, Russian scholars who had visited Italy and corresponded with him expressed support for his astronomical observations while attempting diplomatic interventions on his behalf. The less centralized authority structure of a Christianity that accommodates both Eastern and Western traditions may provide more space for scientific inquiry to proceed without immediate religious condemnation. Mathematics flourishes in Russia earlier than in our timeline, stimulated by the practical needs of navigation, surveying the vast territories, and astronomical calculation. Russian mathematicians, building on both Byzantine Greek traditions and contemporary European advances, make contributions to geometry and trigonometry. When Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz independently developed calculus in the late 17th century, Russian mathematicians engage immediately with these revolutionary ideas. And the subsequent priority dispute includes Russian voices calling for recognition of both men's contributions. The foundation of the Russian Academy of Sciences occurs in 1724, as in our timeline, but as the culmination of a long tradition rather than an innovation imposed from above. Peter I, rather than looking westward from an isolated position, collaborates with existing institutions to create a formal academy that links Russian scholarship with European learned societies. The Academy attracts leading scientists from across Europe not as foreign experts bringing knowledge to an ignorant land, but as colleagues joining an established intellectual community. Medical knowledge develops through constant exchange. Russian practitioners, familiar with folk remedies using herbs from the vast forests and steppes, share this pharmacological knowledge with European physicians. During plague outbreaks, Russian experience with epidemic disease in the vast spaces of the empire contributes to understanding of contagion and quarantine. When variolation, the precursor to vaccination, is introduced to Europe from the Ottoman Empire, Russian physicians, familiar with similar practices among Central Asian peoples, help validate and refine the technique. The study of linguistics and philology benefits enormously from the cultural bridges between Russia and Europe. The relationship between Slavonic languages and other Indo-European language families becomes clear earlier when Russian and European scholars collaborate. The discovery that Sanskrit, Latin, Greek, and Slavonic languages share common roots is made sooner, accelerating the development of comparative linguistics. Russian scholars' familiarity with both European and Asian languages positions them to play crucial roles in deciphering ancient scripts and understanding language evolution. Technology flows in multiple directions. Russian metallurgical techniques developed for casting the enormous bells used in Orthodox churches influence European bell founding and later cannon manufacture.
Russian expertise in river navigation and the construction of flat-bottom boats for shallow waters is adopted by engineers planning canal systems in Western Europe. The Russian innovations in winter transport, including specialized sleds and the use of frozen rivers as highways, inform Scandinavian and Alpine transportation development.
By the beginning of the 20th century, the world shaped by centuries of European-Russian cooperation looks markedly different from ours. The Russian Empire, stretching from Poland to the Pacific, is not the backward autocracy of our timeline, but a modern, industrialized state with representative institutions, developed civil society, and high levels of literacy. Constitutional reforms, influenced by European models but adapted to Russian conditions, have gradually transformed the Tsarist autocracy into something approaching a constitutional monarchy. The great cities of Russia rival those of Western Europe in beauty and sophistication. St. Petersburg, founded as in our timeline, but developed with even greater European influence, is a glittering capital that hosts international congresses, scientific conferences, and artistic exhibitions. Moscow, the ancient heart of Russia, has preserved its unique character while embracing modernity. Electric trams run through streets where medieval churches stand beside Art Nouveau apartment buildings. Theaters stage performances of Russian composers whose works blend Orthodox musical traditions with Western forms, creating a distinctive Russian Romantic style that has influenced composers across Europe. The Trans-Siberian Railway, completed in the 1890s, is a pan-European achievement. Engineers from Germany, England, and Russia collaborated on its design and construction. European capital financed much of the project, seeing it as an investment in opening Asian markets. The railway carries not just freight, but also ideas, as passengers traveling from Paris to Vladivostok witness the diversity and unity of the European-Russian world, from Gothic cathedrals in Poland through Orthodox monasteries in central Russia to the frontier cities of Siberia, where European and Asian influences blend. Education is universal and compulsory, introduced through reforms of the mid-19th century. Universities exist in every major Russian city, and Russian scholars routinely win recognition in European scientific and literary societies. The literacy rate approaches that of Western Europe. A robust publishing industry produces newspapers, journals, and books that circulate freely, though still subject to some censorship, far lighter than in our timeline's Russian Empire. Public libraries, modeled on those in Germany and England, provide access to knowledge for all social classes. The industrial development of Russia has proceeded steadily through the 19th century. The coal and iron of the Donets Basin fuel steel mills that produce rails, machinery, and armaments. The Baku oil fields, developed with European technical assistance, make Russia a leading petroleum producer. Textile mills in Moscow and St. Petersburg employ hundreds of thousands of workers in conditions that, while harsh by our standards, are regulated by labor laws similar to those in Western Europe. Trade unions, though sometimes suppressed during periods of reaction, exist and advocate for workers' rights. Agriculture remains the livelihood of the majority, but it has been transformed by mechanization and improved techniques. The great estates of the nobility, gradually broken up through reforms that compensated owners while freeing peasants, have given way to a mixture of large commercial farms using modern machinery and smaller peasant holdings organized into cooperatives. The famines that plagued our timeline's Russia are rarer and less severe, as improved transportation and storage infrastructure allow grain to be moved quickly to areas of shortage. The political system, while retaining the monarchy, has evolved toward greater representation. A parliament or Duma with real legislative powers has existed since the mid-19th century. Its establishment negotiated peacefully rather than extracted through revolution.
Multiple political parties represent different interests and ideologies, from conservative monarchists to liberal constitutionalists to moderate socialists. While the franchise is still limited by property and education requirements, it is gradually expanding. Universal suffrage seems likely within a generation. Social tensions exist, as they do in all rapidly modernizing societies, but they are addressed through reform rather than revolution. Labor strikes occur and are sometimes violently suppressed, but more often are resolved through negotiation. The revolutionary movements that in our timeline would explode in 1917 exist here as well, but they are smaller, less desperate, and more focused on achieving further reforms within the existing system than on overthrowing it entirely. The comparative prosperity and the examples of peaceful reform at Western Europe provide alternative models to revolutionary violence. The relationship between Russia and the rest of Europe at the dawn of the 20th century is complex but fundamentally cooperative. Alliances shift, trade disputes arise, and diplomatic tensions occur, but these are the normal frictions of great powers maneuvering within an established system, not the existential conflicts of our timeline. Russia participates fully in international conferences, cultural exchanges, and scientific collaborations. Russian artists exhibit in Paris, Russian scientists present at conferences in Berlin, and Russian diplomats are respected figures in every European capital.
Consider the profound differences between this imagined world and the history we know. In our timeline, the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity created a fault line that persisted for nearly a millennium. Russia developed in isolation, nurturing a sense of distinctive civilization opposed to a decadent and heretical West. This separation bred mutual incomprehension and fear. Europeans viewed Russia as Asiatic, despotic, and threatening. Russians saw Europe as morally corrupt, spiritually empty, and hostile. The consequences of this division shaped our modern world. The religious wars that devastated Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries were more destructive because Christianity was already fractured. The Reformation shattered an already divided church, creating not two Christian traditions, but dozens, each often at war with the others. Millions died in conflicts that combined religious fervor with political ambition. The 30 Years' War alone reduced the population of Germany by perhaps a third. Russia's development in isolation from European intellectual and economic currents retarded its progress. The Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution all reached Russia late and partially. While European societies gradually developed constitutional governments, individual rights, and capitalist economies, Russia remained an autocracy with a serf population that in many ways resembled slaves. When reform finally came in the 19th century, it was too little and too late to prevent the catastrophic revolutions of the 20th century. The great game between Britain and Russia over Central Asia consumed resources and attention on both sides throughout the 19th century. The suspicion and hostility poisoned relations and made cooperation on other issues difficult. In the Far East, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 revealed Russian military weakness and contributed to the revolutionary ferment that would explode in 1917. European powers, rather than seeing Russia as a partner, viewed it as a rival to be contained or an opportunity to be exploited. The First World War, when it came in 1914, aligned Russia with Western Europe against the Central Powers, but this was an alliance of convenience rather than deep partnership. The strains of the war exposed the weaknesses of the Russian state and society. The revolutions of 1917 overthrew the monarchy and eventually brought the Bolsheviks to power.
The Soviet Union that emerged became an ideological and geopolitical rival to the West, creating the Cold War that dominated the second half of the 20th century. The Cold War divided Europe and the world into hostile camps. Nuclear weapons poised humanity on the brink of annihilation for decades. Proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and elsewhere killed millions. The Berlin Wall symbolized a continent split between incompatible systems. The economic development of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union lagged far behind the West. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, the legacy of 70 years of communist rule left Russia and its neighbors struggling with economic chaos, political instability, and social dislocation. Even after the Cold War ended, the legacy of centuries of mutual suspicion has proven difficult to overcome. Russia's integration with the West has been partial and troubled. NATO expansion eastward, seen as defensive necessity in the West and aggressive encirclement in Russia, has revived old tensions. Conflicts in Chechnya, Georgia, and Ukraine reflect unresolved questions about Russia's place in the European order. Economic sanctions and counter-sanctions damage both sides. The hope for a peaceful, integrated Europe, including Russia, that briefly flourished in the 1990s, has given way to renewed confrontation. In the alternate world we have imagined, none of this occurred. The centuries of cooperation built trust and mutual understanding that made the catastrophes of the 20th century either impossible or far less severe. Without the isolation and backwardness of Russia, the conditions that produced revolution might never have developed. Without the ideological divide of communism, the Cold War would not have occurred. Without the Cold War, the second half of the 20th century might have been an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity. The human cost of the divergent path our real history took is almost incalculable. The First World War killed approximately 20 million people. The Russian Revolution and Civil War killed millions more. The Second World War, with roots in the unresolved tensions of the First, killed perhaps 70 to 85 million. Stalin's collectivization, purges, and gulags killed tens of millions of Soviet citizens. The Cold War, while avoiding direct great power conflict, generated numerous proxy wars and the ever-present risk of nuclear holocaust. All of this suffering might have been avoided if the bridges between Russia and Europe had never been burned.
As you drift towards sleep, consider the fragility of the world we inhabit. A theological dispute in 1054 over the precise nature of the Trinity and the authority of the Pope created a division that shaped a millennium of history. Had different choices been made, had compromise been found, had tolerance prevailed over dogmatism, the entire trajectory of civilization might have been altered. Russia and Europe might have been partners rather than adversaries, and countless lives might have been saved. This alternate history is not a claim that a unified Christian church would have created paradise on earth. Human nature remains flawed in any timeline. Ambition, greed, prejudice, and violence would not have disappeared. Wars would still have been fought, injustices committed, suffering endured. But the specific catastrophes of our timeline, the particular horrors of the 20th century, might have taken different forms or been avoided altogether. There is a melancholy in contemplating paths not taken, in recognizing that history turned on moments when different choices were possible. Yet there is also a subtle hope, a recognition that the world we have is not the only world that could have been. If the past could have been different, then perhaps the future can be shaped by the choices we make today. The divisions that separate nations and peoples are not inevitable or permanent. They are human creations that can be unmade through wisdom, tolerance, and goodwill. Imagine falling asleep in a world where the great cathedrals of Kiev and Moscow were built in partnership with architects from Chartres and Cologne.
where Russian and European scholars debated philosophy in Latin and Slavonic, where the Tsar and the kings of Europe met not as rivals but as colleagues within a shared civilization. Imagine the 20th century without world wars, without communism, without the Cold War, without the nuclear terror that shadowed our grandparents' lives. Such imaginings are not escape from the world we inhabit, but a way of understanding it more deeply. By envisioning how things might have been different, we see more clearly how they came to be as they are. We recognize the contingency of history, the role of choice and chance, the moments when humanity stood at crossroads and took the path that led to our present. The Orthodox churches of Russia still stand, their onion domes golden in the winter sun. The great cathedrals of Europe still soar toward heaven, their Gothic arches reaching upward through centuries. They exist in the same world, but separated by history's decisions, by schisms maintained, and opportunities for reconciliation missed. Perhaps in some other universe, in some other unfolding of time's possibilities, they were never truly separated at all. Let these thoughts accompany you into sleep, these visions of a world that never was but might have been. In the space between waking and dreaming, the borders drawn by history become permeable. Russia and Europe are no longer enemies, but partners, their peoples united by faith, culture, and shared purpose. The conflicts that scarred our world fade into mere possibilities that were never realized, and for a few hours at least, before tomorrow's news reminds us of enduring divisions, we can rest in the peace of an imagined harmony. Sleep now, and dream of bridges built instead of burned, of understanding instead of enmity, of a world where the east and west of our civilization found not opposition, but complementarity. Dream of what might have been, and perhaps in dreaming, glimpse what yet might be, in some future time when the wounds of history have finally healed, and the divisions of centuries are at last overcome. The night is deep, and the journey through alternative histories comes to its close. Rest well in the knowledge that history is made by human choices, and that the future, unlike the past, remains unwritten. The world that might have been reminds us that the world that will be lies in our hands, shaped by the decisions we make, the bridges we build, and the understanding we cultivate. Until we meet again for another journey through the roads not taken, may you find peace in sleep and wisdom in dreams.